And I welcome Ben Austen to our group today. And he's a journalist from Chicago, and he's an author of the book Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. I'm going to share my screen and put that up. Let's see. There it is. Everyone see that? Okay. Yeah. So that's the book that I wrote, and I wrote a review about it recently in our April newsletter. He also wrote a book called High Risers about the Cabrini-Green housing project, and it's a book about public housing, and which was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction, and named one of the best books of 2018 by Booklist. And Ben also teaches creative writing at the University of Chicago. So I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There we go.
We were also seeing your emails.
I'm sorry?
We were also seeing your emails on your screen. So,
on my screen.
Never mind.
Got it. Oh, before. Yeah. Okay. Now that's better. Okay. So Ben, tell us a little about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school, and about the professional choices you made.
Thanks you, Chuck, for inviting me to your group, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm a Chicagoan, born and raised. I did have a walkabout where I left for a while of my life, but I've been back in Chicago for about 10 years with my family. I live on the South Side. I was just telling Chuck, I live about a block from the high school that I went to on the South Side, the public school, and also a block from the synagogue, which is across the street from Barack Obama's house.
Right.
And I'm a journalist for the last, I don't know, 25 years, 20 years. I was a high school teacher before that. I was I was an editor at Harper's magazine before that, and then a high school teacher before that. And yeah, I like writing. It's a way, and reporting. It's a way to make sense of the world. It's a way to engage. It's a way to writing is thinking. It's finding a way to make meaning. And so I've always been interested in that. And I've always been interested in writing about Chicago, and then writing about social justice issues, about the inequalities in our world, but also the beauties and joys that are part of the world too.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And how did you get interested in criminal justice, and particularly?
So, I mean, maybe there's a twofold answer about this book in particular, but probably the first one is a more general one, which was relevant to everyone on this call, which is I feel complicit in what we do in this country. What we do in this country isn't normal, and it's not normal in terms of punishment, in relationship to the rest of the world. It's not normal, and even in relationship to our own history, it's not normal. Mass incarceration is a product of the last 50 years. It's not like we were great before then or even good, but in terms of jumping from 200,000 people in prison across the entire country to now 1.2 million, we're living in complete abnormal times, and sort of to fiddle with sort of small reforms and then the kind of backlash against them is not going to cut it. So probably like all of you, it's like, how do we keep on announcing that and trying to shake people up, and hopefully my writing is a way to do that in some form. Another story that needs to be told about what we're doing. And this is one of the great civil rights and social justice issues of our time.
Yeah.
So that's a part of what I do. In terms of this book, I mean, I could go into that, Chuck, and that I wrote a book. My last book, as you said, was about Cabrini-Green, and I wrote about a crime that happened there in 1970 because it was a major turning point for the development. Two police officers were assassinated, and really, by snipers. I mean, they had no idea it was coming, and they were community relations police. It was a terrible, terrible crime. And if you people here probably have heard about Cabrini-Green before, it's a
But you
place.
should take a moment to describe
Yeah,
Cabrini-Green
Cabrini-Green.
in Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah, Cabrini-Green was a massive public housing complex, 23 towers, even as many as 18,000 people on really just a few city blocks. And we had in Chicago, we had the second uh, greatest number of public housing units in the country behind New York. And these were buildings that were in great disrepair. They were underfunded. They were mismanaged. They were, segregated. They were stigmatized. And I got interested in writing about Cabrini-Green because of its both when it was being torn down in the 2000s to think about this legacy of public housing. We used to do this thing where we believed as a country that we would provide housing for the people who could afford it the least. What was this experiment of high-rise public housing, which was now largely disappearing? And also Cabrini-Green being this place of great infamy and in quotes, appears in TV shows and movies and every news story. So I wanted to explore that and to sort of see where the reality and myths bumped up against one another. But really, like in terms of being a mythical place, a kind of like symbol, it starts in 1970 with this murder. It is the moment that that launches it from Cabrini-Green to Cabrini-Green in quotes, or not an idea, an abstraction.
Yeah.
And so I wrote all about it because it was such a turning point, and not just in a metaphorical sense or in a media sensational sense. That had real effect on people's lives. About a sixth of the residents move out. They don't want to live there. They've heard such bad things about this place where they're living. Because police officers were killed, police are harassing people, garbage won't pick up. So it was really a big turning point. Two people were convicted of that crime, a 17-year-old named Johnny Veal and a 23-year-old who worked as a janitor. And so when the book comes out in 2018, somebody reaches out to me and says that 17-year-old who was convicted in 1970, he's still in prison pretty much 50 years later, 48 years later, and he's innocent and he's coming up for parole. Mm-hmm. And I had not interviewed Johnny Veal, even though I feel like I'm a pretty good journalist, but it didn't cross my mind to think of like this 17-year-old in 1970, before I was born, would still be sitting in a cell a half a century later. And so I had to rectify that. And I tracked him down. I visited him in prison, and I had to sort of learn his story. But at the same time, I started thinking like, okay, and he's coming up for parole. What do I really know about that? And so I started going to parole hearings at the same time here in Illinois, in Springfield, in the state capital.
Right. I see. So yeah, one of the main figures in the book is Johnny Veal. The other is a man named Michael. How did you get to know him?
Michael Henderson, I met when he was already out. He had just gotten out of prison after 47 years.
I see.
And he's from Southern Illinois. And I met him. We were at a training for lawyers to work to help other people to get out on parole. And I wanted to tell his story too. I think it was a way to I mean, the kind of writing I do is sort of trying to be holistic and tell a whole history and all the politics and the context, but also very personal and narrative driven. So it should be much more engaging than just a history or analysis. And so to live lives with people. And Michael was somebody whose story, I knew he was going to get out. So I could tell the story of both what parole means in coming before a parole board, but also once you're released. And he had a different kind of story than Johnny too, which I felt was important to tell. Johnny said he was innocent, and that has its own issues in terms of coming up for parole, which is a terrible means to assess innocence. You're actually punished if you claim innocence, because the commodity that you could have to get free is remorse, and to say, you're sorry and that it's contrition and I've changed. And if you're saying you're innocent, it actually hurts your chances. Michael was different. Michael was a teenager. He was out one night and he shot another teenager in a sort of a stupid moment, which is the vast majority of crimes in our violent crimes in our prison are like that, of young people who do violent things, and they're, for the rest of their lives, they suffer for them. And so that was a story that I felt like I needed to tell too. The majority of people in prison, or are there for committing violent crimes, and we have to, in order to change things, we actually have to think about how we feel about that, not just our sense of mercy can't stop with wrongful convictions.
Right. Let me just, before we zero some more in, and Michael and Johnny, you had mentioned, about how abnormal it is, what we do to people who enter the criminal justice system. Perhaps you could expand that a little bit more, and how did it become so abnormal, even more abnormal than it was over the last 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, just the numbers are astounding that we as a country, one single country, lock up 1 in 4 of the world's incarcerated population. And many of you have probably heard that before, but it's just hard to fathom. And that these prison sentences of 50 years, youth who were convicted, people who were convicted when they were teenagers, that they're to sentences that are life sentences. That's unheard of in any other Western country, any other, especially wealthy country like us. So, yeah, and part of this research was also finding out that parole is central to this story. That parole was really a flawed system throughout. And people in prison, after civil rights or during civil rights, and a lot of protests that were going on the streets and cities. There was a prison movement, a prison rights movement, and in the 60s and 70s, and led to many uprisings in prisons, but also demands. And one of the chief demands that people in prison were bringing up was, let's get rid of parole and indeterminate sentences, because they feared that parole boards were biased and racist and indifferent and would just never let them out. A parole is invented as a system that's supposed to be a reform. The idea that if prisons are actually about rehabilitation, then when is the right time to assess whether somebody's rehabilitated? And it's illogical to think that a judge at trial would be able to tell the future. So let's create this body of people who would revisit them in 5 years and 10 years and see how they're doing. But it didn't turn out that way. Your prisons never really invested in rehabilitation. They were much more about warehousing. And also, the people appointed to parole boards, were still much more interested in ongoing punishment than about really assessing return. So the elimination, parole gets cut in many parts of the country beginning in the late 70s. And part of that changing of sentences leads to these taking away discretion from both parole boards and judges, and giving it, in a sense, to politicians who get to set laws that decide when people get out and decide what kind of punishments to do. And they just start escalating. What started as something rational, maybe a fixed terms would be more fair. They just expand and expand. And really, mass incarceration is this story of laws that make prison time as a punishment much more certain, and those punishments longer and longer, right, with fewer options for release. That's how you go from 200,000 to our peak of 1.6 million. And that's abnormal. And then the kind of add-ons, sort of like the Get Tough era that prosecutors can do if you have, a gun crime, or if it's near a school, or all the other ways that you add another 20 years. And so sentences go from 18 to 60 and 80. We now have, I said there were 200,000 people in prison in the whole country in the 1970s. We have 200,000 people just who have life sentences now, or the equivalent. So that's just that portion.
Right. Well, one of the issues that our organization's been involved in for a number of years now is to end the abuse of solitary confinement or prolonged isolation. What did you learn about solitary from Michael and Johnny's journey through the system?
Yeah, Johnny gets sent into solitary. He's identified by the prison when he's about 28 or 30 as a troublemaker. He's trying to survive there, and sometimes that involves, and he's in a gang when he's a youth, and he's still in a gang when he's during his 20s in prison. And they send him on something which is called the circuit at that point, which you go from solitary unit to solitary unit across the entire state, and they move you about sometimes every week, sometimes in a month. It was adopted from war to disorient people. But he stayed in solitary not for weeks, which is what the United Nations says is the longest amount of time someone should be in.
15 days, actually.
Yeah, but he was there for 7 years.
Wow.
And which is just as you guys know, it's torture. The lack of communication, the lack of connection to the outside world, the physical abuse each time he was moved by the guards. When his mother died, he couldn't go. So yeah, it's part of these long-term stories for sure. And many of the people who I've worked with in this have had this experience. We during the same era, the Supermax is created, which replaces this thing that Johnny was on, which was called a circuit, which they just send people to special, isolation prisons. We got rid of ours about 20 years after in Illinois, about 20 years after it was created, because it was agreed that it was torture. And there was a powerful movement among both people in prison and outside to get rid of it. We still have solitary, but we got rid of the Supermax.
Are there any limits on solitary in Illinois or not?
No, there's a law that is going through the legislature now to try to change it.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Always yeah. We found that in our experience, the correctional officials have said to us in many occasions, in fact, I know their speech by heart. Their speech by heart is that we cannot maintain security in the prisons without the use of solitary confinement. And if you put limits on solitary, even 15 days, there will be mass resignations of correctional officers because they feel they can't do their job with that. So that's, I just heard that recently in March, actually, at a committee hearing in the Maryland legislature. So,
and Chuck, I mean, that gets to one of the things I was interested in parole, and I think you could do the same thing with solitary, is really to think about what is the point of all this. We do this thing more than anyone else in the world, and so why do we do it? Why do we punish? Like, what do we hope it accomplishes?
Yeah.
And the great illogic and tragedy is that we don't have an answer. That what you're describing is a sense of a system that is really about, just warehousing and getting a kind of revenge and separation. We call these correctional institutions, but we're not really invested in corrections. The guards who are correctional officers are not trained in anything but what you said is policing in some way, and they're even reluctant to do that. But they don't have any other training in sort of human behavior or psychology or social work. I had the great fortune during this reporting of visiting prisons in Norway and Finland, and to be a prison guard there it takes years of training, and you have that kind of training, and it's incredible what you're described of, like, the guards would have mass resignations. I mean, this is a desired job in other countries, and it's fulfilling because you're actually invested in people's success. When people leave prison, you feel a sense of achievement, like graduation, and versus here where it's just there's none of that. So it's a low wage job. It's just that it's only oppositional.
Right. No, there's no accountability for rates of recidivism or helping people get re-engage in the community. No,
Yes.
exactly right. Tell me a little bit about one of the things that you emphasize in the book is about the role that victims' families play in the decision of whether to grant someone or not grant someone parole. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, these are often terrible crimes with meaning terrible suffering. And for families that have experienced this kind of loss, there's like it's like a line is drawn in their life. There's only before and after. And so parole hearings where they come every year or 2 or 3 years or 5 years, however long it is, to oppose release becomes a kind of mission and even a way to respect their lost family members. And I would see these families who are still coming back 40 years later, 50 years later, to do this work to make sure that some senior citizen wouldn't get out of prison, and imagining that person still as the 20-year-old or the teenager from the 1970s, really, and as a threat, and that they felt no sense of healing or any change in this way. And it made me think, I mean, it made me see how much the system fails them.
Yes.
That, we offer people who are suffering essentially one possibility, which is to ask for more punishment.
Yeah.
And, you could either on your own decide you want to pull away, but that's really the only device we offer. And so people take that. And yeah, it's very telling. I spoke to one police officer whose father was murdered in the line of duty, and at a hearing, and he was there to oppose release of a guy who had served 50 years already and was going to get out in a year no matter what. He was going to age out. And he told me a story of delivering. He was working and he delivered somebody to the prison. And there was a kind of mix-up because this should never happen. As he's delivering a guy to the prison, the person who is convicted of his father's murder is walking past him.
I see.
And he, in his head, calculates how to murder the guy. He tells himself, like, I'm going to take my shoes off and my socks off really quickly so I won't slip on the slick industrial floors, and I'm going to choke him out. He decides not to do it. But that story, it just stayed with me. I mean, I feel for that person, but the idea that what we offer somebody as a revenge killing, even after 50 years, is we have to find a system that offers healing and help instead, because it's painful.
Yeah, I mean, it was so helpful for me, illustrative to, as a rabbi, I'm interested in how people change, whether people can change or not. And give forgiveness to someone else. All these such important issues in our faith, and it just struck me how the way it's set up is that everyone is stuck in that one terrible incident that occurred, and no one can move out of it in a way. Even the families of the victim seem to be paralyzed by that. And it's not that they should forget what happened or forget the memory of the loved one, but they should be able to also move on a bit from that. And it just seems like having to come back every time this person's up for parole and they have to go over the story again just seems to keep them mired in that past.
And they're correct that their presence influences the parole board. That's undeniably true. It's statistically proven that by showing up at parole hearings and keeping the wound open and showing their ongoing suffering, it does sway the parole board members. So much of what we do is returns to the original crime. I mean, parole, in theory, is about what happens after the crime. The crime is never going to change, but parole is supposed to assess everything that happens after. Did somebody use their time in prison well? Who have they become? How have they matured? How have they grown up? Yeah. And that isn't what is weighed at parole hearings or anywhere, as we're describing here. It's always going back to the original crime. And sitting in those hearings, I sat in hearings for years. You hear the story of the crime, somebody tells it, And it does always feel present tense.
Hmm.
You know, it's like it's like reading a novel. It's not something that's happened in 50
Right.
years ago, 40 years ago. You imagine it in that way. It really everything is set up against release and to sort of relive that moment and to relitigate it over and over and over
Yeah.
again.
The eternal present in a way.
The eternal present.
Yeah. Wow. Um, let me, Johnny was, as you mentioned, Johnny was convicted of murdering two Chicago policemen, and you presented certainly a case that Johnny could not have murdered these policemen. So I was just wondering how you came to that conclusion. What kind of research did you have to do, um, and why were you persuaded in that?
Yeah, yeah.
And
The
how is
first,
it that and how is it then that was missed 50 some years ago?
sure, sure. I mean, I guess the first thing I'd say, Chuck, is that his innocence wasn't the most important thing to me. He was 17-year-old at the time of the crime. He
Right.
wasn't even convicted as the shooter. He was convicted as an accomplice. He had spent 50 years in prison, and he was this extraordinary person with amazing achievements and so generous to other people in prison, someone whose life was being wasted inside who could add value to the world. And
Yeah.
so I was already, in terms of him, his worthiness for release, I was convinced about that, whether he did the crime or didn't. And I told him that the first time we met. And I knew that the board they cared about the crime, so I said I'd research it. Uh, and so I had his word, and I also had all these connections at Cabrini-Green, people who were at Cabrini-Green when it happened. So I said that I would start interviewing people, and I would also go through the case with his. He had a pro bono lawyer. It's 15,000 pages, and go through the police records. And there very quickly it was that this sort of, the idea that there was guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in this trial seemed, uh, far-fetched. And I found his lawyer from 1970 and interviewed him. Uh, some other people who were pulled in by the police. How did this happen? It's the way that it happens in most cases. After this crime, the police pulled in 100 people from this housing development, from this public housing development, most of them teenagers. I spoke to several who were slapped around, who were intimidated, who were told what to say,
Yeah.
and a case was made. And Johnny's name came up because he was a gang member. He was 17, and it sort of stuck. And there were so many contradictions in the testimony. In the police reports that gunfire coming from 6 different locations, but then somehow the police pick one location, and then after that point, every story confirms that his
Uh,
friends say that he was at that location. His friends who say that later recanted their testimony. They said they were intimidated. Um, yeah, one of the key witnesses was another teenager who was in a rival gang who said that Johnny bragged to him. It just seems so far-fetched.
yeah.
A story made up by police. I also researched several other cases from that era. It was a really tumultuous era, as many of us know, and especially between the police and Black communities. In Chicago, for example, the police had just murdered the Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, as he slept in his bed. There was a feeling that there was a kind of war between the police and the Black community. There were about 80, between Martin Luther King's assassination and this crime, there were about 80 people killed by police, almost all of them Black. And there were 15 on-duty police officers murdered, which is an incredible number.
Wow.
So this is that moment. And in several of the other trials that went on in that moment, it was proven in court, or it was found in court, that the police had manufactured case against people.
Right.
And they seemed almost identical to this trial.
Yeah.
But in this one, this was sort of came after several exonerations, and there was a feeling that this one wouldn't be lost.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a long history of police brutality in Chicago, especially directed toward the African American community. Um, we interviewed an author who did this book. I guess there's a scandal that was uncovered about 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. This policeman who was basically shocking people. He had this black box. He
Yeah.
brought in
Flint,
suspects.
you interviewed Flint Taylor.
Yeah. Anyway,
John Burge tortured, and
John Bird, the whole John Bird story. Yeah.
yeah, it's terrible. One of the guys who was tortured actually came to my writing class 2 weeks ago
Oh,
to
wow.
talk to students about his experience. It was harrowing and powerful, and
Uh-huh.
a mix of forgiveness and suffering that can't go away.
Yeah. Um, so they were incarcerated during COVID. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So how did that affect other incarcerated people and staff? And how did the
Yeah.
system react to it, the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the ways that Johnny is a phenomenal person. He volunteers at his prison to be a COVID ambassador, to even convince people who have many reasons to doubt institutions that everyone should get the vaccine. And when it first came out, but yeah, it adds to, prisons where death rates went way up. It meant that any sentence could suddenly be a death sentence. Um, it's so wild to think that we went through that, and that seemed like a moment where we might really take advantage of the world being turned upside down and to rethink what incarceration is. Because in the same way that we imagine like we only have so many hospital beds, so we have to really think who is the sickest to need them. That was a way to rethink prisons in that moment. Who do we really feel is needs to be here? Who has 3 months left on their sentence, and there's really no difference whether
Right.
we could have reduced numbers significantly. And what's most astounding of that moment is that we didn't. There were release rates were higher in 2018 than they were in 2020.
Yeah.
So the year before COVID than during the pandemic, during the peak of the pandemic. And yeah, that whole experience. I mean, so there's a kind of irony for my own work is that during the pandemic, it was, Johnny Veal and I spoke all the time, and doing the reporting of telling his life story. I was stuck in my office, and he was able to call, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and so we sort of really hashed out his whole life story, which I'm able to tell in this book. It's sort of due to COVID that all that time spent. And also then the parole board shut down during that, like everything, there were no
Right.
parole hearings. So he didn't have another hearing until 2021 when there was a sense of how we could do this with social distancing and so on.
Wow. Huh. And did you learn more from them about just generally about medical care in prisons and how well or not it's offered?
Oh, I mean, yeah, terrible, awful. I also teach in prisons here in Illinois, and it's just, yeah, I mean, the stories from the people who were in there during this time of, people would just, suddenly in the rumor mill too, I mean, which is, suddenly somebody in your cell just disappears, and you don't know, but everyone was around them. There is no social distancing in prison. You're in a cell with people with hundreds of people on a wing. When did you get masked? When did you get soap? Those things to clean. I mean, it came really late. Yeah, and then when people are returned to the prison, the kind of rumor mill there too. Were they infected? What's going on? What about the guards who are not, who are going out on weekends and then bringing who have the virus, or bringing it into the prison? Yeah, just terrible. I mean, so this is one of something about parole boards. They're able to correct sort of, in theory, and they do this sometimes, like egregious things. And so I would be at parole hearings sometimes when they would hear of just terrible medical malpractice in prison. And those were moments sometimes when the board would overlook the original crime and think, well, this is somebody who went in for a prostate exam and now has been bleeding for years and nothing is being done. And, this person, we should let them out because they're being tortured and they're medically.
Yeah.
And so I saw that the board was able to do that. And, so medical release is another form of release from prison, which could be adopted much more.
Right, right. Part of your book turns to the process of leaving prison and re-entering the community. So what are some of the obstacles that returning citizens face and have to overcome in order to establish themselves?
Yeah, I mean, maybe people know this, but it's just, a time when if we had a correction system and we wanted people to succeed on the outside, the moment people leave prison, they're the most vulnerable they're ever going to be. They've been institutionalized sometimes for decades. They need a lot of services and help. And it's the moment when we deny the most. And so we, in terms of housing, in terms of even social services and social safety net programs. And so we, there are thousands of restrictions on what people can do and ways that people get caught up, rules they have to follow. And so, we have a terrible recidivism rate. 1 in 4 of people who enter a state prison today are there not for committing a crime, but for violating a technical aspect of their supervision.
Mm-hmm.
1 in 4. So we have this kind of like circular system of release and feeding people back in because of these onerous restrictions on them. Yeah, and so I mean, Michael, who we haven't talked that much about, I spend so much time with him. He goes to a really good halfway house here in Chicago, and I spent a bunch of time with him there. And he does great. He's such an optimistic person. And even after he looked at all the ways even that his decades of incarceration taught him how to succeed, and he sort of thought about that in the outside world. But he has to. One of the rules is that when you move, he's moved to another building in the halfway house, and when you move, you have to check in with the police. And he goes to the police station, and it's scary because he still has all these kind of institutional feelings of, what it means to be around guards and police. But he's sort of overcoming it. And then finally, one of the police officers sits down and says, I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson, but you're under arrest. And he's arrested. They take his backpack and his hoodie and they cut all the strings out. They cut the strings out of his shoes. They put him in a jail cell, and he has no idea what happened. He sits there for a couple days, and finally somebody figures it out that when he was moved from one apartment to the other, they didn't move the base to his ankle bracelet, his ankle monitor. So it looked like he had missed his curfew.
I see.
That's how easy it is.
Yeah.
And he would have been sent back to fill out basically the rest of his sentence, which was one of these indeterminate sentences of 200 years. He would have died in prison. And that's so common. It's painful.
Yeah, well, we're very aware of that here in this area of how minor violations of the rules, not committing a crime, just making one of the expectations that they have can send someone back to prison.
And for Chuck, if I may, I mean, for Johnny Veal, when he got out, he did get out. He gets out in the book. I'm telling an end to the book.
Yeah.
But he is still cast as this sort of existential threat. Here he is, 68. He's working. He's paying taxes. He gets married. He's volunteering at a church, to deliver food and furniture to people in the community. And the politicians are casting him as, this cop killer on the loose. And as a kind of Willie Horton character. He's actually shows up in political ads here during the midterm elections in 2022 for how could the governor release this man, his parole board. So a guy who served 51 years and was assessed by a parole board is released, and it's still this idea of a travesty. And so, yeah, he's still shaped into a kind of Willie Horton figure here. And that's another aspect that you don't shed this kind of, we don't celebrate this sense of this is success. This is it's still
right.
A horrible act that somebody would finally get out.
Yeah. yeah. It sounds awful. That really sounds awful that he became a poster boy for some political figure.
Yeah, everybody on the board who
The
voted for
shootout,
him lost their job. They didn't so there was a complete overhaul of the parole board.
right? Because of who the victims were.
Just the whole, yeah, the politics of it, and that
Yeah,
what happened in the midterms in 2022 of a kind of pushback, a backlash
yeah,
against what felt like a reform moment, that this became a way to really push that.
yeah, yeah. Well, I guess one more thing to talk about. Running so, but I am interested in your view of what can be done. I mean, is the system just hopeless in some way, or I mean, what about the correctional officers and the challenges they face, and do they get the kind of training that I assume they don't get the kind of training they should get? At least that's my experience over here, and in the world that I live, the part of the world I live in. But I wonder if you have any observations about
Yeah.
correctional officers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think some things do feel hopeless. I mean, one of the things that, when I speak to a lot of people about correctional officers is really the union contract. And, that's such a barrier to any kind of change.
Yeah.
Which is painful, like that the idea that a union is fighting for a status quo, which nobody is happy about. Uh, but I looked at Parole. I think part of what appealed to me is that I saw a lot of promise in it, like a kind of, I write about this possibility that I would somebody like Johnny or Michael, who could still be sitting in a prison cell, you're out with them in the world. And so that there are these mechanisms that even if they failed and do a terrible job for decades, that there's this promise of being seen and heard in your humanity of who you are, and to move beyond the crime and to think about release and success. And so I don't know if, expanding parole opportunities, to think about other forms of release, to think about, hundreds of thousands of people who are serving extremely long sentences, of how they get a second look. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But I also think, there are ways that we can amplify the stories of success, so that the stories that are sort of like the Willie Horton type poster boy story don't win the day again and again and again. That the story of the crime, which always feels, you said, like an eternal present, that we have to actually talk about the actual present, where people are adding and benefiting society and succeeding. They don't have to be remarkable people either. They just have to be
Right.
living their lives. And so
Right.
how do we amplify those stories? I feel like this book is one piece of many. And there are many, many ways where people, both in prison and out, speak and tell their stories so powerfully and eloquently. And so we have to keep on spreading those stories that change is possible. I mean,
Yeah.
people, yeah, the idea, you talked about religion in a way. I mean, something about parole is so fundamental to our belief about what we imagine a prison system is, or what a religion is, or how a society works. Like, we believe in second chances and we believe in change. And somehow we've
We
cleaved
say
that.
that. We say that.
We say that, and in most cases we do. We've cleaved it away from some notion of fear, which has come to dominate, and that's often racialized fear. But we know that that core is there, and we can build on that. That sense of empathy, and we can build on that. We're not starting from zero.
Yeah.
We do have that shared belief. We might not live our ideals, but we still have something that we can strive for, and we can tap into.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn it to our audience here. So let me, if you'd like to make, there are some comments in the chat, but if people like to raise their hands, I can call on you too, because I think we can manage that. So let me just, anybody would like to ask a question here? Be happy to. So Virginia, I'll start with you.
Thanks. My name is Virginia Spatz. I live in Washington, D.C. Like I hear the state bell being tested at the D.C. jail every Shabbat morning. But I grew up in Chicago, and the question that I want to ask has to do with a different book that I read. I haven't had a chance to read yours yet. It's called A Wall is Just a Wall by Reiko Hillier. And her premise is that prisons used to be more permeable. Like our idea was that people would get out and they would be released for Christmas or Easter or whatever. And that it's really a racial system that has just decided whoever's in prison needs to stay in prison, either for their labor or just because that's where they belong. And here in DC, we're seeing our very modest changes to our criminal code have been just eviscerated by Congress and by locals who are arguing that if you've even been charged with a crime, you belong in jail. And then like you just lose any chance of any kind of life. So my question is, I guess it's a little bit like what Chuck asked you about, like, is what ails us reformable, or do we really need to address something so much more fundamental about who gets to be a human? Maybe that's too hard a question to ask you. I'm sorry, but
No. I mean, I have a podcast too called Some of My Best Friends Are, and in all the kind of like humor that's supposed to mean, but it's actually with my best friend. We went to high school here on the South Side together, and he's a Harvard professor. And in one of the episodes, we each go to European prisons to talk about just what you're saying of how permeable they are, how from day one they're built on reentry. Everyone is focused on that. Like, here's what you have to do to get out. And it's a system where, and so then you start to imagine, well, if it's about built-in reentry, what do you need? It needs to be more normal. There's this theory of normalization where it has to be much more like the outside world. So there isn't this institutionalization that happens. You have to be able to visit your family. They have to be closer to them. All the things that you would hope. You have step down programs, which, very quickly lead to open prisons where during the day you get to go out, all these things. And then this is an answer. My best friend Khalil Muhammad, when he was coming back from the prisons he visited in Germany, his name is Khalil Muhammad, so he stopped by TSA, and the guard says, "Where are you coming from?" And he tells him, "I'm visiting prisons. Why were you in Germany? Why were you doing that?" "Because I want to see prisons that work better." And he's like, "It's obvious why they work better there. They don't have Black people," which is the most depressing answer to what you said, which is, that we have to deal with racism, which is at the core of all this. But then you think of, like, in DC, that bail reform there, which has been going on for decades, and Illinois is now became the first state to eliminate cash bail. You guys are also, proof of how that works, that you don't have to hold people pre-trial, pre-detention. And, all the data is there. There's no, 97% of people return to their court cases without being held in jail. So we have the evidence. We have this. One of the things about mass incarceration means that we have statistics on everything. Like it's a numbers thing. We know about, when people get older, that their recidivism rates are so much lower. We have to fight both on the kind of rational, logical side and on the emotional narrative story side too. This is a longer answer, but I brought up Willie Horton. And it looks like most of the people on this call are old enough to remember that election in 1988. I do too. But but if you don't know, I mean, it turned the presidential election. It was the first George Bush debating Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. They were the Democratic and Republican candidates. And in Massachusetts, there was a furlough program where people could, just as you were saying, it's like an outside prison. During the day, they could go out, they could visit with their family, they could work, and then they had to come back. And on one of these furloughs, this guy Willie Horton committed another murder, and it's sort of used against a caucus, like here, this blackface on ads and, fear mongering, and it worked. And it worked so well that we still have a phrase in criminal justice called the Willie Horton effect, which, comes up over and over again. We've seen many examples of it. The craziest part of that story is that the furlough program was 99% effective. This was this anomaly. And pretty much what we've done in this country, is we've allowed the exception to create the rule. The exceptions become law. And that's something that we also have to push back again. That the 1% or the terrible exception can't be the thing that shapes of all of our ideas. And of course, in other aspects of our life, we don't do that at all. None of us would ever drive, for instance, if we lived in that way, where we thought about danger and risk in that sense. That's a long answer to your question, but it's a great one.
Reverend Thompson, please.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for writing this book. As I was reading part of it, and the focus on solitary that we've talked about certainly is really, it's just cruel. But I also wondered in reading it when you were describing one situation with a cell where, in order for a person to kind of make it to the toilet or to the end of the cell, the other inmates had to stand up on the bed to let them by. And it just speaks to me about the tightness of fit in these cells and the crowding and just having somebody on top of you. I mean, solitary is bad, but I wonder if you could just also speak to what it's like to have to live in such close proximity with another person that you don't even have space to turn around.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. And I'll preface this by saying I have never been incarcerated. And I'm a journalist, which means there's, I remember speaking to Michael Henderson and interviewing him for hours and hours. And he just looked at me at one point and said, there's something about this that you will never understand. And that's true. And I think that's not just being humble, but it's actually being a good person and journalist to sort of think about what you can't know, and then how can you get as close to that as possible to try to comprehend. And it's like cutting the distance in half over and over and over again. And so I've been in many prison cells. I've been in prison cells to visit, but and to tour, but so what I'm reporting on there is people telling me their stories. And yeah, that sense of punishment in our country is supposed to be the loss of your liberty. This is so important. Liberty is so important that, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's right there. And the other thing, what we end up doing is punishing in all these other ways beyond taking away someone's liberty. We want people to suffer physically and psychologically and medically and nutritionally. And so that sense of not having privacy, not having any space to function. Yeah, it's horrible. And, so the number of stories of people who are, 8 to a cell, 12 to a toilet. That's another way that we, and of course that only happens if we are able to separate ourselves from thinking about, even the golden rule or somebody's humanity. We've sort of turned people we forget about them in the way that I hadn't thought about Johnny as a 17-year-old still sitting in a cell. I'll say one more thing is when I went to the prisons in Northern Europe, it was the exact opposite. That sense of normalization. One of the things that was so striking is the prison, the cells locked from the inside. And if you sit with that for a second, that you have a room and you can lock the door from the inside because that's what privacy is and feeling protected. That's so beyond what we would ever imagine for the United States.
For sure.
Yeah.
Galen.
Thanks, Chuck. Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for writing this book. So I work on systems called shadow prisons, which I wanted to ask if you had encountered when you were working on parole in Illinois. Illinois is one of 20 states in the federal government that have these systems, and they were developed in the 90s and into the early 2000s as a backdoor around the truth in sentencing laws that were imposed in the 70s and 80s. They are basically a parole sentence that is imposed after somebody has already been sentenced in the criminal system. So you do your truth in sentence time, right? Most states it's 85%. You get to the gates, and then they say, oh, well, but we think you might reoffend based on some vague psychological problem. And so we're going to impose a civil sentence that is not double jeopardy, allegedly, because it's under civil law. And they then can either control them in the community on what they call conditional release. It's just another form of supervised release. It's normally run by probation and parole. So it's still DOC, probation or parole agents or officers that are administering this. And the goal of this system is literally the opposite of the second look legislation that we're starting to see, thankfully, now in many jurisdictions, including the district, where people who had super long sentences or judges have an opportunity to take them home, which is like a kind of like a parole for people who would have been there longer. This is people who should have gone home that aren't released on their release date that are held indefinitely afterwards. I'm curious if you've encountered that, and if, having just learned about it, it seems, if you can imagine anything that might be problematic about that.
I mean, everything. I am just learning about that. Who does it benefit? And who is doing it? I mean, we have a progressive prosecutor here, Kim Fox, who is trying to look at ways, and here meaning in Cook County and Chicago area, who is looking at ways to reduce the prison numbers. And so what you're describing is, so many ways where her hands were tied and judges' hands are tied, that they can't do anything to these truth in sentencing. The add-ons, they have to impose 80-year sentences or sometimes life sentences. And what you're describing is who would want to do that? Is it the Department of Corrections, just because they're bureaucratically doing this? But what's the benefit of holding people for a second sentence?
Well, there's an entire industry that's grown up around it, as you can sort of imagine. Yeah. They've repurposed the facility in Illinois is in Rushville, and it's a shuttered juvenile prison that they have co-opted to indefinitely warehouse people in this civil confinement setting. But originally, it's just like everybody was talking about, the really organization of crime, where politicians wanted an answer, so they had dug themselves a hole by creating truth in sentencing laws. And that means that they actually have to let people out on their release dates. This is a back door for politicians to say, oh, well, these people that we really don't like, or the people we're really scared of, we can hold indefinitely. But of course, it's never applied to the people we're really scared of, because those people had such long prison sentences that either they never go home, or they are so old by the time they get home that they're highly unlikely to ever reoffend. But if it's okay, I'll reach out to you separately.
Please reach out to me. I wrote down what you said, and I'd like to know more.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, we're at 1 o'clock. I appreciate all the messages in the chat. I was looking to see if there were any questions there. It seemed like there were no, people were making interesting statements, but I don't see any real questions. So let me give a last chance for a question before I thank Ben. Yes, Mr. Loftheim. Just unmute yourself there. Yeah.
Yes. I have a young friend who's been incarcerated for more than 20 years. He's within a year of his release, and yet there's been absolutely no reentry program at all. He is in a maximum security prison. He's allowed, on a good day, 2 hours out of his cell. What can we do, people totally outside of the system, to affect change?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking about reentry. I mean, I spoke at a high school here in Chicago, and none of the students had heard it about. They didn't even know the phrase mass incarceration, even though they were living it in a way. But they didn't have a historical perspective. But a girl who was in ROTC, who was training to be in the military, said that when people leave the military, they have to take a class before they come back to society, right? And she said, is there something like that for prison? And it was such an astute observation in the way that you're saying. Like, you're institutionalized in the military in some of the same ways as in prison, except it's 100 times more in prison. And so how do we not have ways that people succeed, set it up? I guess, for your young friend, I mean, finding a really good halfway house where there are classes and where there's a community of support. I've seen that the success rate of people who go to good ones here, goes up astronomically. Yeah, and this is, yeah, how do we affect change? It just seems so logical that we'd want people to succeed on the outside. And so I know that's not the case. And even what we just heard, that, in some ways, the hedging against release has always been to add more on in this. We have this mass supervision state now. Mass incarceration created this mass supervision state. We have many more people on probation and parole than we do actually in prison. Another like 4 million.
Right.
So it's a whole other world to tackle, that the kind of success we want. But I do think that normalizing it and the lack of fear, and there are more places that are offering work, and understanding that just because you've served time doesn't mean that you're a danger, and that you're ready to be a part of and contribute to the world.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Any more questions before we wrap it up here? Okay, I don't see any hands okay, so I want to thank, how about raising our hands? A big thank you to Ben for coming on.
Thank you, everybody.
Really appreciate your forthright answers to the questions and describing, and the commitment you have to this issue is really very impressive and very moving. So I wish you all much success in your work, and look forward to another book. Sandy has her hand up. Okay, one more question here. Sandy, do you want to give your question? Just unmute yourself.
Maybe that was waving.
Sandy Lovin. Oh, maybe. Okay, maybe it's waving. Okay, maybe that is. Okay, so very good. Thank you, good. I thank everyone who participated. I appreciated all the comments in the chat. I hope everyone gets a chance to look at them, because there's some important information in the chats as well. So please do that. And I want to wish everyone a good rest of the day and week. And again, many, many thanks for Ben for taking time to be with us for this hour. So
thank you for reaching out to me. Thanks for writing the review, and thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye. If I should. Okay, I'm gonna close this off.